Hey everyone, welcome back to the Deep Dive. We're all about getting to the heart of complex topics, and I think today's is going to be a really interesting one. We're diving into a book that has really had a lasting impact, Milton Friedman's Capitalism and Freedom.
Yeah, it's a classic for sure. It all started as a series of lectures back in 1956, first published in 62, and then Friedman added a preface in 82 reflecting on, how it had landed and its impact. It's really a foundational text when we talk about the role of government, especially in a free society.
And even if you've heard of Friedman, actually going through Capitalism and Freedom is pretty eye-opening. What we want to do today is pull out the big ideas. What's his vision of a free society? What does he think about how much the government should be involved in things? And we're going right to the source, using what you pulled from the book. I think there's some surprises in store, some real thought-provoking stuff. This book covers a lot of ground. We're talking about like the basic purpose of government, money, trade, taxes, education, discrimination, even social welfare programs.
It really does touch on so many different areas. At its core, it's grappling with this essential tension. How do we balance individual freedom with the power of the government? And one of the first things Friedman talks about is this idea of the free man. Not someone who's just expecting handouts, but someone who's actively thinking about how to use the government to protect freedom and reach their goals.
Okay, so right off the bat, we're talking about the free man. It sounds like we're already getting into this potential conflict between what individuals do and what we do collectively through the government.
Exactly. Friedman says government's absolutely necessary, protecting us from outside threats, making sure we don't hurt each other, setting up a system where markets can work. But here's the catch. He also sees it as the biggest potential threat to those very freedoms it's supposed to protect. Why? Because of concentrated power. Even with the best of intentions, things can go wrong when too much power is in one place.
So how do we handle that risk? How do we use government's power for good without it becoming like overbearing?
Friedman highlights two main principles to keep freedom safe, and you can see these reflected in the U.S. Constitution. The first one, the scope of government needs to be limited, seriously limited. Basically, he's saying the number one reason for government to exist is to protect freedom. Anything beyond that, you got to really prove it's worth it. The benefits have to outweigh the cost, and not just by a little bit. And he puts a lot of faith in voluntary cooperation in private businesses and organizations, not just because they can be efficient, but because they act as a check on the government's power. They help protect those fundamental freedoms like speech and religion.
It's like having a strong private sector there as a counterbalance. Makes sense. And the second principle?
Decentralization. If government's going to do something, better it's done at the local level, not the state level, and even better at the state level than the federal. His reasoning is all about choice and being able to move around. If you don't like how things are run in your town, especially something like education, you can, in theory, move to another town where things are more aligned with what you believe. That gets much harder when you're talking about state or, even worse, national policies. Even if people rarely move because of politics, just having the option puts a limit on what local governments can get away with.
It's like a built-in accountability system. Your freedom to choose where to live helps keep things in check. Now, Capitalism and Freedom is written a while back, mid-20th century, and it seems like the word liberal has really changed its meaning since then. Friedman talks about that, right?
He does. And understanding how he uses that word is super important. He's comparing the classical liberalism of the 19th century with what he calls the 20th century liberal. The 19th century liberal was super suspicious of centralized power, whether it was government or big businesses. They really pushed for individual liberty and spreading the power around. The 20th century liberal, well, they're more comfortable with a strong central government. As long as it's democratic, they think it can do a lot of good in society. And Friedman points out that this is especially true when you look at economic policy. It's almost like they flipped the meaning completely.
Yeah, that suspicion of concentrated power, it almost sounds closer to some libertarians today.
Yeah, there are definitely some parallels. And that leads us to another core part of Friedman's argument, economic freedom and its connection to freedom in general. He's saying that economic freedom isn't just some nice bonus, it's crucial for getting and keeping political freedom.
Could you give some examples of how limiting economic freedom actually limits individual liberty?
Okay, imagine needing a government license to work in your chosen field. That's a direct restriction on what you can do with your life. Trade quotas that limit what people can buy and sell from other countries, that's limiting your freedom to trade with whoever you want. Price controls that say what you can charge or pay for things, that's messing with your ability to make economic decisions. Even something like telling farmers how much they can grow, all these things to Friedman, they're all chipping away at individual liberty.
It's not just about having a good economy. It's about people being able to make choices,
Oh,
right, in all these different parts of their lives.
absolutely. And then he goes further, saying that a free market actually supports political freedom. It creates centers of power that are independent from the government. Think about it. In a pure socialist system where the government runs everything, everyone works for the state, how hard would it be to speak out against the government, to criticize them? You could lose your job, everything.
Sounds pretty risky, maybe even impossible.
That's Friedman's point. He uses the example of the Hollywood blacklist during the Cold War. People were getting shut out of the film industry for their political beliefs. But even though they were blacklisted, some were still able to find work. Using fake names, they could still earn a living, even though the government wasn't giving them any options. Having a relatively free market, it gave them a way out, a safety net.
A powerful example of how economic freedom can protect people who disagree with the government. Okay, let's dig into this free market that Friedman's so passionate about. What does he see as its main function in a free society?
He sees it as an incredibly effective way to get widespread agreement without forcing people to conform. In the market, you vote with your dollars. If you want a blue shirt, you can buy one, even if most people are buying red shirts. You don't have to go along with what the majority wants, like you often do in political decisions.
So the market's like a system of proportional representation, but for your preferences as a consumer. It avoids that winner-takes-all problem that you see in politics.
Exactly. And because it can handle so many different preferences, it actually reduces conflict in society. We don't have to agree on everything. The more things are left to the market, the fewer issues we have to fight over in politics. It just lowers the pressure on everyone to conform.
So the government sets up the rules, like an umpire in a game, but the market actually plays the game. It limits how much the government has to get directly involved.
Exactly. Now, where exactly should that line be? How much government intervention is the right amount? Friedman admits it's not always easy to say.
Yeah, it's not like there's a simple on-off switch.
He introduces a couple of ideas for when it might be justified. Neighborhood effects, also called externalities, and technical monopoly. Basically, situations where it's really hard to do things just through voluntary exchange, where what you do affects other people in a big way.
Let's break those down. Can you give us some examples?
Sure. Think of a city park. It benefits everyone in the neighborhood, right? Better air, green space. But it's almost impossible to charge everyone who benefits. That positive spillover, that neighborhood effect, might be a good reason for the government to fund it. Compare that to, say, a national park like Yellowstone. There are clear entrances, you can charge people to get in. Friedman would say, in those cases, if people are willing to pay, private companies could run those parks just fine.
So it depends on whether those who benefit are also the ones paying. What about technical monopoly?
This is when, because of the technology or how things are set up, it just makes more sense to have one provider. Local phone lines used to be an example. Or take roads and highways. You could try to charge people every time they use a road, but imagine the cost of toll booths everywhere. A gas tax, even though it's not perfect, is a much easier way to fund roads. Friedman says these situations might call for some government involvement, but even then, you gotta be careful.
You have to weigh the pros and cons. And he's always stressing the importance of individual freedom. That's a big part of the equation for him.
Absolutely. Don't forget the impact on liberty. And he makes this interesting point. The more government already does, the more you should worry about the impact of doing even more.
It's like there's a diminishing return on government intervention, at least when it comes to freedom. So with these principles in mind, Friedman actually points to a bunch of things the U.S. government was doing that he didn't think were justified. What were some of the big ones?
Oh, he goes after a lot of programs. Things like price supports for farmers, tariffs that make imported goods more expensive, limiting how much companies can produce, rent control, setting minimum or maximum prices, even interest rate ceilings.
That's quite a list, and it really goes against a lot of mainstream economic thinking. Now, one area he spends a lot of time on is the control of money. He says it's a tricky area. Government needs to be involved, but that power can be dangerous. Why is that?
Because controlling the money supply gives you a huge lever to affect the whole economy. And historically, it's let governments basically tax people without officially passing a law. Just by messing with the currency or simply printing more money, they can cause major economic problems. The question is how to give the government responsibility for money without giving them too much power.
Friedman looks at what happened after the Federal Reserve was created in 1914, comparing it to before. What did he find?
His research was very critical. He said the economy actually became less stable after the Fed was created, whether you look at the money supply prices or how much the economy was producing. He admitted the world wars had an effect, but he said even in peacetime, things were wilder. He even blamed the Fed for making the Great Depression worse.
Wow, he's saying the institution designed to prevent economic problems might have made them worse.
That's his argument, based on how he saw history. He thought the Fed made some big mistakes, especially letting the money supply shrink drastically in the early 30s.
So how do we solve this? How can government be involved with money without causing these huge problems?
His big idea was to have rules for monetary policy, rules set by law, not by people's opinions. He called it a government of law instead of men. He compared it to the First Amendment, the Bill of Rights. We don't want the government deciding who gets to speak freely case by case. Same with money, he argued. We need rules to protect us from short-sighted decisions or political meddling.
So instead of giving the feds so much freedom, you'd have these preset rules telling them what to do. What kind of rules did he have in mind?
He explored different ideas, but a big one was having the money supply grow at a steady, predictable rate. No more sudden changes. He thought that would keep the economy much more stable. He also criticized things like government controlling the price of gold or taking over the gold market. He saw those as incompatible with a truly free economy.
Let the market decide, not the government. Now, what about international stuff like trade and finance? When it comes to keeping track of payments between countries, what did Friedman think was compatible with a free market?
A lot of common approaches back then, things like fixed exchange rates, where governments try to keep their currency's value pegged to something else, those usually come with a bunch of restrictions on trade and investment. Friedman argued that's totally against the idea of a free market. He thought the best solution was to just let the market decide, have freely floating exchange rates, let supply and demand determine the value of currencies.
Hands off, let the market do its thing.
Yeah.
What about government spending and taxes? What were Friedman's big ideas there?
This is interesting. He pointed out that even though everyone talked about using the federal budget to stabilize the economy, government spending after World War II was actually one of the most unstable parts of the economy, and not in a good way. He said it was more like the budget was causing problems, not fixing them.
That challenges a lot of traditional economics, the idea that government spending is a tool to smooth things out. Why did he think that?
He was skeptical of that simple Keynesian idea that more government spending automatically leads to a much bigger boost in the whole economy. He said, people forget that when the government borrows money, it can push interest rates up, which makes businesses less likely to invest. In some cases, the government spending might just replace private spending, so the overall effect is zero. It's like there's a limited amount of economic activity to go around.
So just pumping money into the economy might not always be the answer. Okay, let's talk about education. Friedman did see a role for government here, right?
He did, but with some important conditions. He argued that requiring a minimum level of schooling and having the government help pay for it made sense because of those neighborhood effects we talked about. Basically, having more educated people benefits everyone. But he was really against the government actually running the schools.
What was his problem with that? Why not have government-run schools?
He thought it stifled competition and innovation. You end up with schools that are slow to change and maybe not that great. He wanted a system where parents got vouchers from the government and could choose any school they wanted, public or private. He thought that would force schools to compete for students, offer better quality, really focus on what parents and kids need.
That's a pretty radical change from how things are usually done. He did address the argument that public schools are important for promoting shared values, especially when you have a lot of immigrants coming in, right?
He acknowledged that. Public schools did historically play a role in making sure everyone learned a common set of values, especially learning English. But he said you could still have minimum standards with a voucher system, like requiring schools that take vouchers to teach in English. He also talked about the technical monopoly problem in rural areas where there might not be enough kids for multiple schools. But he thought better transportation was making that argument weaker over time.
What about paying for college?
He thought some public funding for college was okay, especially for training future leaders, but he questioned why the government should pay for so much job training. Like with K-12, he thought any government money should go directly to students so they could choose where to go. Let government-run universities charge tuition and actually compete. He even talked about how sometimes people don't invest enough in their education because it's hard to get loans. He had this wild idea about investors funding education in exchange for a share of your future earnings.
So instead of paying back a loan, you'd share a portion of your income. That's pretty innovative. All right, let's tackle a tough one. Capitalism and discrimination. What was Friedman's main point here?
He argued that a truly free market actually works against discrimination based on things like race or religion. Why? Because if you're a business owner and you discriminate, you're basically making things harder for yourself. You're limiting your potential employees, your potential customers, based on things that have nothing to do with how good they are at their job or how much they're willing to pay. You're putting yourself at a disadvantage compared to businesses that just care about making money.
It's like you're paying a price for your prejudice. It's costing you money.
Exactly. You're choosing to discriminate, and it's hurting your bottom line. He contrasted that with government forcing businesses not to discriminate, like with the FEPC laws. He was worried about the principle of the government telling businesses who they can and can't hire. He even drew a parallel, and it's a bit uncomfortable, to things like the Nazi Nuremberg laws or the Jim Crow laws. Both were examples of the government using its power to enforce discrimination.
So, if the government can ban discrimination, it could also, in theory, require discrimination. Scary thought.
That was his concern, the principle itself. On the specific issue of segregated schools, which were often run by the government, he admitted it was a tough choice. Force segregation or force integration. He said if he had to choose, he'd go for integration.
Okay, let's talk about monopolies. Friedman actually distinguished between different types of monopolies, right?
Yeah. He said monopolies that happen within industries where one company dominates everything, those aren't as big a deal as labor monopolies, like strong unions that control who can work in a field, or monopolies created by the government through licensing and regulations. He gave examples like the United Mine Workers Union and the Texas Railroad Commission, showing how powerful these labor and government-backed cartels could be.
What about patents and copyrights? He treated those differently.
He saw those as different because they're basically about defining property rights for ideas, for inventions, and creative works. It's like owning a piece of land. You have a right to control what happens to it. The question is whether having these intellectual property rights is ultimately good for society or not.
Now, Friedman's famous for his stance on the social responsibility of business. What's his view?
He argued that the main responsibility of a business is to make profit, as long as it's playing by the rules, being ethical, not cheating or lying. He didn't like the idea that companies and CEOs should have some broader social responsibility beyond serving their shareholders. He thought it was a bad idea. Who are these unelected business leaders to decide what's good for society?
So, focus on making money within the rules, and then let individuals use their resources to pursue those broader goals. Now let's talk about occupational licensing, another thing Friedman looked at critically. What was his take?
He separated certification, which he thought private organizations could handle, from licensing, where you need permission from the government to work in a field. He admitted there might be a case for licensing sometimes, using that neighborhood effects argument, like you want to make sure doctors are competent so they don't accidentally cause outbreaks. But he said, always weigh the benefits against the downsides.
What were the downsides of licensing that he was worried about?
He thought it could create artificial barriers to entry, making it harder to become a doctor, a lawyer, whatever. That means less competition, higher prices for consumers, and maybe even lower quality because you have fewer people doing the work and less incentive to innovate. He used medicine as an example, pointing to the AMA, how they controlled which medical schools were approved, which limited how many doctors there were. He argued that meant fewer people were getting medical care and there was less pressure to find new and better ways to do things.
So fewer providers means longer wait times, higher costs, and maybe even less innovation. Makes sense. What about the distribution of income? What did Friedman think was fair in a free society?
He said the basic principle is to each according to what he and the instruments he owns produces. But he acknowledged that this depends on having clearly defined property rights, which are ultimately enforced by the government. He also talked about how some jobs might pay more because they're less desirable in other ways. Interestingly, he questioned why we treat income from inherited talent differently from income from inherited wealth. He thought the distinction was kind of arbitrary.
If you can inherit a fortune, why not inherit a talent? Interesting point. What did Friedman think was the good side of income inequality? Why was it necessary in a free society?
He said it serves several important functions. First, it helps allocate resources efficiently without anyone forcing anyone else to do anything. Second, it creates centers of power that are independent from the government, which helps limit government power. Third, it allows wealthy individuals to fund unpopular or innovative ideas that might not get support otherwise. And finally, it makes the distribution of rewards more impersonal and less political. He also looked at the actual data on income distribution and found some surprising things, like how more capitalist countries actually had a smaller share of income coming from capital. He also criticized the graduated income tax, saying it wasn't very effective at reducing inequality and might actually discourage people from building wealth.
So some surprising arguments about income inequality there. Finally, let's wrap up with Friedman's views on social welfare programs. He was pretty critical of a lot of them, wasn't he?
He was. He had big problems with public housing, saying it often made things worse for the poor and mostly benefited special interest groups. He argued that minimum wage laws actually increased unemployment among low-skilled workers, the very people they were supposed to help. He said farm price support programs were wasteful and mostly helped rich farmers. He questioned the whole idea of Social Security as a way to transfer wealth from young people to old people, even if the old people didn't really need it. He thought it was wrong to force people to buy annuities through Social Security and questioned whether it really stopped people from becoming a burden on society.
So he saw a lot of unintended negative consequences in these programs. What did he think was a better way to fight poverty?
He proposed the negative income tax. Basically, instead of having all these separate programs, just give people below a certain income a direct payment from the government. He argued that it would be more efficient, less bureaucratic, and would encourage people to work because they wouldn't lose their benefits if they got a job.
A simpler, more direct approach. Now, in his last chapter, Friedman discusses liberalism and egalitarianism. What was the difference for him?
He defined liberalism as the belief in individual dignity and freedom, with equality meaning everyone has the same right to that freedom. He contrasted this with egalitarianism, which he saw as trying to redistribute wealth based on ideas of social justice. He argued that ultimately these two ideas clash. You can't have perfect freedom and perfect equality. He thought societies had to choose one or the other, and he clearly favored individual liberty.
So at its core, capitalism and freedom is about this fundamental tension between freedom and government.
Exactly. Friedman is constantly warning about the danger of too much power in one place and how even well-intentioned government policies can backfire. He uses historical examples like the regulation of railroads, the income tax, and changes to the money supply to show how things can go wrong.
He really believed in the power of individuals to make their own choices, to pursue their own goals within a clear set of rules, and he was skeptical of the government trying to override those individual choices.
You got it. He thought those attempts often failed or even made things worse because they went against basic human nature, the desire to improve your own life.
This has been a really thought-provoking deep dive. It makes you think about all the government programs we have today. Are they really working? Are they actually hurting freedom in ways we don't realize? It forces you to ask, what should the government be doing and what should be left to individuals?
Absolutely. And for anyone who wants to go deeper, I highly recommend checking out Capitalism and Freedom yourself. There's a lot more to unpack, a lot to think about.
Thanks for joining us on the deep dive. Catch you next time.